We are now joined on Zoom by Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so very much for being with us here on SABC News. I was reading an online online article which said that we can expect three headlines once all is done and dusted. 1, Biden wins. 2, shock win for Trump. 3, shock landslide win for Biden. Do you see that as being accurate according to your observations of the US elections?
Thank you so much. I think anything is possible. And I think if we look at the ways in which the Electoral College itself works, it is potentially a way of entrenching minority rights and minority votes. So it's this voting college where there's a guaranteed cohort of people who will vote for a particular electoral candidate, and which means that even if you get a massive number, such as Hillary Clinton, who got 4 million more votes in Los Angeles in 2016 than Donald Trump, those votes are essentially wasted. It also means that because of the small margins of votes in swing states, regardless of the lead that a person might have, an unexpected outcome such as the 2016 upset can still happen. This is why the electoral system is extremely vigorous in areas where we would not be necessarily, we would not be associated with great vibrancy. We think of Los Angeles, we think of Florida, we think of New York as the significant state. And yet we will see that places like Wisconsin, places like Pennsylvania, historically a swing state, places like Michigan, places which we don't even have on our tourist destinations, to be honest, when we think about the United States, are extremely important. And we find that both candidates put a lot of work into getting onto the ground there, because that is what can win the Electoral College majority.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the college vote. I mean, there was a lot of talk about it, and I think perhaps in South Africa it's not something we're necessarily too familiar with. Can you take us through this very important college vote in terms of understanding what it means, how it works, and why really there's such an emphasis on it in the US?
Basically, the Electoral College operates on something like a winner takes all, or what the British would call the first past the post system, where the candidate with the highest number of votes in a particular state gets to win, claims that state's electoral vote. So each state is assigned or is given a particular number of these votes based on the number of districts that they have, almost like our ward councils, I guess would be the equivalent in South Africa for a South African context. And then there are also 2 additional votes which represent the state's Senate seats. So Washington, D.C., for example, is assigned about 3 electoral votes because it's the seat of power, even though they don't have any voting representation in Congress. So you need about 270 of these votes to win the presidency. Now, the problem with this is that there's a massive lack of equity in the way that these electoral votes are actually distributed, which is why you find small states and less popular states, which again are not on the popular destinations for people in South Africa, places like North and South Dakota, which are overrepresented because of the required minimum of 3 electoral votes. So basically, it's to do with the history of America. It's to do with the way that some of the concessions which were made after the Civil War. It's to do with the history of disenfranchising Black people, African American people from the vote. So it's a series of historical compromises, and those block votes actually historically represented the votes of white men, and later on the votes of corporate interests. And what that represents is really a very anti-democratic process, which I think anywhere outside of America would not fly at all. And also how static and how unmoving, how undynamic the electoral system in the US has been, because it's based on concessions which were made 150, 170 years ago, which don't make any more sense in today's democratic governance system.
Yeah, it seems as though we've been here before. Some of us might even be suffering from a little bit of deja vu at this point. we had anticipated the last elections that this would be a landslide victory for Clinton. Pardon me, for Hillary Clinton, and of course that didn't happen. And then she lost on what I perceived or saw to be some kind of a technicality. And then we were told about issues like swing votes and things like that. I want to find out, does Joe Biden stand a chance of losing this election based on the very same reasons or circumstance that Hillary lost that last election?
Yeah, you ask a very important question, which is why I think none of us are going to want to call this election until, the fat lady has sung. Fortunately, so far, Joe Biden seems to be outperforming Hillary Clinton in the so-called blue states. And that means that this is where parties like, the third parties like the Green Party, who voted against Hillary Clinton, knowing that their vote might not make a difference, that's where the power came in. But Biden has a much higher favorability and just a popularity, likability than Hillary Clinton did. She was slightly radioactive. He might gain. So I'm looking at other pundits from the U.S. about 500,000 extra Green voters, for example, in places like Illinois, in places like New York, which are very significant states. So it's possible that it is very possible that the same could happen again. But the trends seem to show that Biden seems to have filled and seems to have learned from the mistakes of Hillary Clinton. She may not have worked the blue states hard enough in 2016, and she was also internally a quite polarizing figure. I know many of my friends in the U.S. who are traditionally left-leaning or Democrat, who decided that on the day of elections they were just going to stay at home and wash their curtains, and that sounds like very South African behavior, right? When we're not interested in participating formally in processes. But this time we see that there's a massive level of engagement. There's been a record number of postal votes and people who went to cast their votes even before the ballot, the day of the November the 3rd, I think in an attempt to prevent the sort of nasty surprises that happened in 2016. But really, anything is possible. I'm not going to hold my breath and call it right now. I would say at the moment it looks like the 8-point popular lead for Biden could mean a victory, but we won't know until the last vote comes in.
Yeah, I always wonder in situations like this. I mean, we saw ourselves in South Africa where we were quite surprised by the amount of votes that the FF Plus received, for example. But you would never really hear people talking about, voting for the FF Plus, sort of vocally talking about that. And I wonder if that's the same situation in the US. At the end of the day, this man won the last election. So clearly, we're hearing a lot of people saying they're voting Democrat. We see a lot of celebrities in the U.S. Saying, people must vote for Biden, for example. But it does seem that there is a sort of what I'm going to call, closet Trump supporters who might not necessarily openly speak out that, I'm supporting Trump, but that this does indeed happen. Do you think that this is the case?
Anything is possible, hey. So basically, one of the things that's quite interesting to me is the huge amount of Black people in America who support Trump. There's a whole movement now that I was watching, that I was seeing, which is Black women for Trump, and they're not a huge amount, but they're part of a significant voter constituency, which put Donald Trump in office, and not only because of what they represent as a numeric force, also what they represent as an ideas force. We shouldn't underestimate the idea of an idea. So the idea that there are Black people, particularly Black women, who find Donald Trump in any way palatable, has some kind of cognitive power. Let's also remember that the church base, which is of course the Republican base in the U.S. traditionally, and with its supposed emphasis on family values, whatever that may or may not mean, very conservative values, very 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 steeped in family traditionalism, and very fundamentalist views on some things that I think are quite problematic. Reproductive rights and so on and so forth. also represent a very important voting caucus, including the black church. And then you also then have white working class voters, as we are aware, who are not the only part of Trump's constituency, but they have been the face of the most representative one, the ones that we have seen the most of. So I think there's also like this strange binary of the Trump supporters being seen as people who don't look like him, who don't represent him. So he's a very wealthy, privileged white man who somehow has managed to cross party and class lines to appeal to people who feel socially, economically, and politically marginalized. So working class, very impoverished, socially, economically dispossessed, typically without, a high school education or a university education. So the complete opposite of who he is who he has managed to appeal to, which is quite a feat of political finesse.
Yeah. All right. Let's leave it there. Thank you very much for giving us your time. No doubt we'll certainly be unpacking further with you as time goes and as those results come in. Thank you for giving us your time this afternoon, joining us via Zoom there, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. Thank you.